So I don't normally get into politics on this show by design because I feel like it's nice to have a place where it's just about books, or it's about, I guess in this current season, it's sometimes about pop culture. Just a place to kind of get away from all of that and think about bigger and better things, which is not to say that politics is not a big subject matter or is not important. I just think that we get so much of that in social media, on television, that it's nice to create a space that is separate and apart. Now, that said, I have in the past had authors on this program who are subject matter experts and have written books that are explicitly political, whether it's a conversation about disinformation and the spread of disinformation, or it's a conversation with somebody who is a media analyst and a careful observer of the political system and our history. Those kinds of conversations can be fascinating and useful, but they can also, I think, just add to what feels to me as a media consumer as a kind of cumulative stress. This stress of consumption of the 24-hour news cycle, constantly riding the roller coaster of that and trying to keep your cortisol levels at a reasonable mark. Do you know what I'm saying? So I've tried to sort of shy away from that. And I say all of this as a way of preambling a monologue that is going to be political, I suppose. It's going to be me talking about the political season that we are in globally, but maybe more so the political season that we are in here in the United States as we head toward an election in November. And it's crazy. And it's crazy because it's crazy. The stakes of this election in the United States could not be more extreme. It's a choice between autocracy and the imperfect furtherance of a democratic republic. Emphasis on imperfect. I don't mean to say that things are great and we just need to keep it rolling. Like, we need a lot of systemic change in this country and even some radical change, I believe. But I think that the extremity of the choice, in my observation, is sometimes viewed by people on the left as one in which it might be better to just go off the cliff, Thelma and Louise style, and to just blow it all up, to essentially commit suicide, thinking that this will incentivize the left to coalesce in a serious way and to push for true radical reform. That is our only hope for survival. That's a huge risk, in my view of things. And it's not one that I'm willing to take because I have kids. I'm not willing to go off the cliff in hopes that maybe it somehow catalyzes a radical response and some kind of necessary revolution. I think a lot of people would probably get killed, and that has to be a cost that you're comfortable paying. I'm not comfortable paying with lots of people's lives. I'm not comfortable wagering the future that my kids and potential future grandkids are going to live in based on some potential good that might come of it. It also may be the case that if you go off the cliff, you spend the rest of your life living in an autocracy, in a kind of darkness and awfulness that's maybe even hard to fathom now. That too could happen, and maybe is the more likely scenario. So I get uncomfortable when I feel people kind of rooting for that, especially on the left. It feels very strange to me, and I see it sometimes. What I see more often from the left is a kind of like a fearful hope that we can push through, that we can salvage what we have in this country and make it better through democratic processes and institutions, that we can repair the damage that has been done by this Supreme Court, which is itself radical and has claimed radical power not only for the judiciary but also for the executive in the past couple of weeks in a way that I don't think we even fully appreciate. It's very dangerous what has happened, in my understanding of it. Stripping the administrative state of its power, transferring that power to the judiciary so that the regulation of business, enterprises. The decision-making around that no longer resides with experts, but resides with judges. And with imbuing the presidency with kingly power above the law. It could not be more antithetical to this country, as I understand it, to give any person exemption from the law. And yet that is precisely what they've done. And that's not just me saying that. There are conservative judges. I want to say his name's Michael Luttig, like an esteemed conservative judge, has said this. Many people, I mean, I sound like Trump now, right? Many people are saying that the Supreme Court has given incredible latitude, and certainly the dissenting justices in that decision, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, all claim exactly that with a real sense of despair. So these are weird times and perilous times. And so you have all of that in your mind, and then you also have in your mind Biden's age and obvious frailty and obvious advancing senility. And I know people can quibble about this. I'm seeing a weird argument unfold among the left about this. Where I stand on it is I would vote for a cold jar of shit over Donald Trump. I literally would. And the reason is that we would at least live to see another day as a democracy. And it's not the ideal scenario. It's not my preferred scenario if I could write one out. But given the choice between Trump and MAGA and autocracy and whatever version of democratic politics, I guess centrist democratic politics that Biden represents, I'll take that over Trump every day of the week and twice on Sunday. So I think there has to be an honest conversation. And I think the good news is that it is happening. It's good news, but it also makes me bristle a little bit because it's good news, I think, that the American political left is capable of this kind of inner reflection and dialogue and argument in ways that the American political right simply isn't. If Donald Trump had blanked out on that debate stage or had a bad night, and by the way, he too exhibits often signs of advancing senility and symptoms that are quite consistent with dementia, we've never heard this kind of self-reflection from the American political right. And frankly, we've never had the media hold Donald Trump's feet to the fire for this or any number of things. So I bristle because there seem to be two different standards applied. But that aside, I think you still have to look at Joe Biden and his age and just be honest with yourself and say, my God, I don't know if he's up for it. Like, can he handle this job, which is exhausting to somebody my age? You know what I'm saying? Like, to think about the rigors of the presidency in your mid-40s can make you sleepy. But to think of a guy in his 80s who is obviously not the weakest person in his 80s, but he's not the strongest, right? There's different kinds of ways to be 81 years old. And I think Joe Biden is somewhere on the lower half of that continuum. There are 81-year-old people who are full of piss and vinegar. Like, that's actually a thing. So I don't want to be ageist. I don't think the number itself should be the deciding factor, but I do think that we have to be clear-eyed about how he is presenting and what the implications might be. And do I know exactly what the right thing to do is? I can't say that I do. Part of me thinks we should go with somebody younger. Part of me wonders if maybe just like the safe, established incumbent is the better option with all of his faults. It's kind of a mess, right? And then on top of that, there is the issue of the war in the Middle East and the carnage in Gaza, which is so deeply upsetting and offensive on a moral level. The killing in Israel of all of these Israelis, followed by the mass slaughter of Gazans, which is way, in my view, way out of hand. Just way out of hand. The whole scene, the whole situation there is just too much to bear. It really is. It's a lot, and America is very much complicit in it. So you have to weigh that piece, or at least I have to weigh that piece. And it's a big complicating factor. And I think that it makes this, there's so many factors in this election that seem to be conspiring to make it a very difficult election about which to speak out if you're me. Because if I'm thinking of this election solely through the lens of autocracy versus democracy, then it's very easy. And I can pound the table and say, whatever you do, just vote against Trump, vote against autocracy. We don't want a dictator, somebody who holds himself above the law, somebody who is only seeking to enrich himself through the presidency and get revenge on his political enemies and pervert the system of justice and exist above the law. This should be obvious. But if I look at the election through the lens of the war in Gaza, and I think of all of those American bombs that have fallen on all of those women and children in Gaza, I feel sick. And I am not anti-Jew in any way. I think I have problems with the Israeli government, and I don't think the two things are the same. And this is why it gets hard to talk about, because in certain quarters, if you say you're sickened by the war in Gaza, people will call you an anti-Semite. I'm horrified by anti-Semitism. I want good things for Jewish people. I also want good things for Palestinian people. And I think this is where most people are. Does anybody else feel like this? It's hard to talk about. And it's scary what we're faced with. And I often find myself on social media wanting to say stuff, but then I don't, because I don't want friends of mine, maybe even particularly on the left, to be like, oh, you think X? Well, then you don't care about Y. Or you care about Y? Well, then you're not thinking about X. And it just feels dicey. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is that it's complicated to me, as things tend to be. And if you're out there and you're thinking, man, this feels complicated, you're not the only one. That's what I want to say. But I'm trying to simplify this for myself. And I feel pretty strongly that we cannot have a Trump restoration. That will be the end of the American experiment. My kids will grow up in an autocracy, in a fascist state. A lot of people are probably going to get hurt if that happens. And more importantly, everything that you think is bad now is probably going to get exponentially worse. Donald Trump is not going to make things in Gaza better. Donald Trump is not going to make things for people of color, for disabled people, for underprivileged people. He's not going to make things better. He's not going to make things better for the middle class. If his first administration is any indication, he's going to make things better for rich white people. That's who got the tax cut in his first administration, a massive tax cut for the top, 1%, 4%, whatever it was. A big tax cut for the rich, and deregulation for fossil fuel companies, and a complete dismantling of any efforts to combat climate change. The consequences would be dire. He would also get to appoint more Supreme Court judges who would preside over us for the rest of my life. I could go on. So the implications of this election are just enormous. And when I think about it in those terms, and I try to make like a simple calculation of it, it doesn't take me too long. Joe Biden, or whoever the Democrats end up nominating, has to win, period. We can figure out the rest later. And what I sort of hope happens is I hope there is a landslide for the Democrats, that we give them control of the government, the presidency, both houses of Congress, and then we hold their feet to the fire. That is actually the best avenue if you want to get politically active and you want people in the streets and you want to see the citizenry engaged. I'd much rather have the citizenry engaged with a unified democratic government and the chance to do things like reform the filibuster and pass universal pre-K and pass a law codifying Roe versus Wade and protecting women's reproductive rights and passing paid family leave, passing a public option to add that to the healthcare system. I say that because I don't think Joe Biden's going to pass universal healthcare. I think that's coming, but I don't think it's coming in this next term. I could be wrong. We can always push for it, you know? I definitely am in favor of it, but I just, you know, I'm also kind of a political realist. So that kind of activism, I think, is the best case scenario versus Trump winning and people are in the streets and the National Guard is shooting at them and pepper spraying them and beating on them with batons and throwing them into vans and sending them off to jail or to prison camps or something awful. I think we need to have a clear-eyed view of just how bad things could get. And what I say to my Republican or my right-leaning friends, and I do have some, I say this to them all the time because I'm kind of relentless. I'm like, look, I don't give a shit what somebody's politics are in a normal world. Like, we can have good faith disagreements about this stuff at a policy level, but where I cannot have a good faith disagreement with somebody is whether or not we should have meaningful elections in this country, whether or not people should be able to vote and have their vote counted, whether or not people of color should have equal access to the ballot box. Disabled people should have equal access to the ballot box and a way to get their ballots submitted and counted. You know, just like basic human rights stuff and democracy stuff. We should all be able to agree on that. And then, you know, the winner gets to govern, and we can have good faith disagreements and try to find some way forward and make compromises where we can, and then have another election and do it all over again, the way that we did it for a long time in this country until Donald Trump came along. And I know there are systemic issues in this country that go back way before him. I know that this didn't necessarily start with him, quote unquote, and I know that it won't end with him, quote unquote. But the process of getting back to some degree of functional democratic governance and sanity, it can start now. I think it kind of started in 2020 and it has to continue. And the last thing I'll say is that there is, I think, some good news to acknowledge, like on the global stage, the elections in Britain and France this past week, Labour winning a huge victory in Britain, and the left in France surprising a lot of people by defeating really soundly Marine Le Pen and what is it called, the National Front, the ultra right-wing fascist wing of the French political spectrum. So like a thrilling victory in France and a big victory for the left in Britain. And I should say, too, that the polls in France in particular were not promising. Most people, most experts, most pollsters, all the people who supposedly know, were predicting a wipeout for Macron and the left in France and a big win for the ultra-right and Marine Le Pen, and it didn't happen. So we have some of that right now in the United States, people claiming to know. Here is what I can say with conviction. Nobody knows. Nobody. And anybody who looks at you and talks with confidence about what's going to happen in November in this country is lying to you. They don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody. I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. It's up for grabs. It's going to come down to us getting out, getting registered, voting, talking to our friends, talking to strangers, knocking on doors, making calls, doing what we have to do. And if you don't think that what we lived through from 2016 to 2020 was insanity, then I say this with compassion. You need to get mental help. Check yourself in. I know that the presidency that we are living through now has its own variations of insanity, but by comparison, it has been boring. Like Joe Biden, flawed, right? We can go through it all. I'm not denying that. But fundamentally, between him and Donald Trump, it's not even a comparison. Donald Trump's a really sick human being. And he has no business being anywhere near power. He doesn't care about anyone. It's complicated. I know people can say Joe Biden is, if you're somebody in Gaza right now, Joe Biden probably seems like a monster. If you're somebody, sitting in that rubble, having lost family members by the dozens, children, wives and mothers, I get it. This is why it's hard to talk about this election, right? It feels like a big old mess. But it's like choosing between a big mess and a way bigger mess. So we have to choose wisely. That's how I feel. I could be wrong. I don't think that I am, in that basic way. But I know there are blind spots I have. I know there are probably things I don't get or don't understand or haven't thought of at all, fail to see, all that stuff. I can freely admit that. But I'm just working it through out loud, and hopefully it's helpful in some way. I think we can win. I think the forces of good in the United States of America can win. I think there is a possibility that this could be an inflection point, and it could be the thing that catapults us into a way better trajectory. This could be another step in the direction of the kind of country that I think we all feel is maybe possible, or we hope that it's possible. But if we decide to backslide into autocracy, it could be 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 years before we get out of it. We may never see the end of it. It's that sort of possibility that really keeps me up at night, and I think keeps lots of us up at night. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks for hearing me out. I know some of you are probably like, oh my God, just shut up. And I get it. So I'm very, I don't talk about this stuff very often, as I said, for this particular reason. And I wish everybody well, because I know how insane and crazy making these times can be. And we just got to hang on. I welcome your feedback. If you have thoughts on what I said, if you have corrections or additions or subtractions, email me. I'm always up to hear it. Like I said, I don't care if you disagree with me. I don't care if you agree with me. Either one's fine. But I'm not somebody who's offended by people calling me out and saying, hey, you're wrong. Just tell me why, and maybe I'll agree with you and say, yeah, you're right. I am wrong. Thanks for letting me know, All right. That's it from me. Thank you for listening.